So I want to talk today about the development of the Chicagoland entrepreneurial ecosystem. I feel like I have a unique perspective to share, and it's because I come at it from several different angles. First, I'm a venture capitalist, and having invested in over 60 companies, I have an investor's vantage point. But for the first time in the history of Chicago, a venture capitalist sits on the executive committee of World Business Chicago. You know, technology entrepreneurship wasn't really given its due in Chicago over the last 15 years. It is now. And it's in part because of our great mayor who recognizes the value, particularly in this moment, of focusing on growth, particularly on digital companies. I want to particularly call out Michael Sachs, who runs World Business Chicago for Mayor Emanuel, who's doing an unbelievably great job of making sure that startup businesses are not on the periphery of thought about the business community in Chicago and growth, but rather at the very center of the city's focus. When I started investing in technology here, there really wasn't much around, and this isn't long ago. I'm not that old. 15 years ago, honestly, this was sort of a desert for startups. Some of you may have started businesses back then, and you know what I'm talking about. There were few venture capitalists. There were even fewer angel investors, and there was very little seed funding available from anywhere. If you weren't a student at one of our great universities, you certainly were not getting the support of any institutions to help you get your entrepreneurial endeavor off the ground. And with so small a support community to rely upon, if you lived in Chicago and had a great idea, frankly, it was much easier to leave, to go to Silicon Valley or someplace else to find funding and to set up shop, find mentors and customers. There was no ecosystem to systematically support new venture formation and growth. And you need an ecosystem. You do. You may not think you do, but boy, when you're out there fighting the fight, having some institutional support is awfully helpful. And you need it to give you this boost to succeed, because the odds of succeeding at building a business, as many of you know, are low. I recently read a compelling article written by Paul Graham, the founder of Y Combinator. And he talked in, frankly, some of the clearest terms about the natural tendency of technology startups is to fail. That's right, it's to fail. And what he means is that we should basically assume that all startups have been poisoned, infected, and that only a very few places like Silicon Valley have been sprayed with the antidote. A few places have the entrepreneurial ecosystem that gives startups a better than average shot at success. And that ecosystem gives them the antidote against what Paul Graham calls startupicide. It should be sort of a disease. I think a lot of us have the bug. By the time I'm done with my remarks, what I'm hoping that you'll share with me is my view that Chicago has found the antidote. It's a great time to be a digital entrepreneur in Chicago. There's something very different going on here, something that we've never seen before. For the first time ever, most of the pieces of a thriving tech entrepreneurial ecosystem are in place here. We're at an inflection point, a tipping point. Whatever you want to call it, something serious has changed. And it's big. And it's really, really big. So what's different? Many of you might think that I'm about to say Groupon. Groupon's an amazing company. But Groupon is more the effect than the cause. Groupon is just one in a wave of new Chicago powerhouses in the making. You're going to hear a little later from Matt Maloney at Grubhub. That's one great example. BrightTag, Braintree, CleverSafe, Savo, Analyte Health, SMS Assist, and many more. They and Groupon are a product of what's now so different in Chicago. So I want to highlight the three things that I think have fundamentally changed here, and then talk about a fourth that's about to change and be, I think, of great assistance. The first thing that's different, some of you may have experienced this, is the quality and the experience of our startup founders. 10 years ago, we didn't have a committed group of serial entrepreneurs. They just didn't exist. Now we do. They've built companies, they've exited, they're now building their second or third or even fourth companies here. I mean, that's a huge asset for our community. They're magnets for talent and capital, and they've learned from their successes, and a few of them have learned from their failures too. And aside from their excellent stewardship of their newest ventures, they're also mentoring the more recent entrants to our startup community. Nothing wrong with being a first-time entrepreneur at all. We want first-time entrepreneurs. What's great is we now have people who can mentor them who've been through it before. Let's take Matt Moog, for example. Some of you may know. He built CoolSavings.com into Q Interactive and had a huge exit and is now building Viewpoints into the world's leading ratings and reviews website. You know, he came to my office when he was putting this together and said, I want to create a Web 2.0 ratings and reviews website. And I thought to myself, my gosh, you know, if you go on the internet, you're going to find, 10 really great, or at least 10 big ratings and reviews website. How on earth are you going to compete with the existing companies? And the answer is, I knew, because of what Matt had experienced in the downturn of '01 and '02, building back Cool Savings into something really great, that if anybody could do it, Matt could do it. And he did. And Viewpoints is the #2 ratings and reviews website out there. Eric Lunt is another great example of a serial entrepreneur. He co-founded SpyOnIt.com and then co-founded and built FeedBurner, both of which had big exits. He was the lead technologist for Google here in Chicago and was recruited to go to a major company on the West Coast. I won't mention their name, Twitter. But he decided to build his own company here, a new startup here in Chicago, BrightTag, which is reinventing the relationship between internet advertisers and publishers. And of course, there are the Groupon guys. Eric Lefkowski and Brad Keywell, I mean, these guys built, well, you know, Inner Workings and Echo Global Logistics and Media Bank and, of course, Groupon. And all of these leaders, all of them, are part of a growing cadre of successful serial entrepreneurs in Chicago. There are many more, too, that I haven't mentioned. Where did they come from? Well, in the last decade, more than 40 technology startups have had exits greater than $100 million. You know some of the names: Orbitz, Fieldglass, TicketsNow, Thinkorswim, Options Express, Archipelago, Navtech, CareerBuilder, and Redbox, and those are just a few. That's billions of dollars to investors and founders and thousands of new jobs. And there were really great entrepreneurs behind those companies, each of whom have already started something new or are soon to do so. So, point one, serial entrepreneurs are here. Then there's capital. Entrepreneurs need the fuel to get started. For too many years, Chicago companies could get later stage funding. That was the classic belief about Chicago. Fine, lots of private equity funding if you're maybe pre-IPO. But very few angel investors, no seed funds, and VCs weren't interested at all in small investments. And that's all changed. The Illinois Innovation Accelerator Fund launched a few short years ago to make seed investments in Chicago-based startups, and it has catalyzed a whole host of really great companies. One of those seed companies is one that I'm invested in called Sitter City. It's a rapidly growing website that helps families find babysitters, nannies, and other caregivers. It's the #2 website out there that helps people find nannies and babysitters and such, and they're soon to be #1. It's now really the largest in at least one or two of those categories, and they recently did a $23 million financing. Hyde Park Angels, Cornerstone Angels, Heartland Angels, and Wildcat Angels have come together in the last few years to give interested angel investors forums for evaluating prospective investments. Just never existed before. Together, these groups have seeded really dozens and dozens of startups. One of those companies is called All Tuition. Founded by Sue Kim, the company is already one of the most talked about startups on the social graph. And early stage venture firms like my own New World Ventures or Apex Ventures or OCA Ventures are increasingly funding seed stage companies. In the last year at New World, we've committed to more than 24 seed investments in Chicago companies alone. And we're providing funding for nearly every Accelerate Labs startup. So point two, the old model where startups would be pulled away from Chicago by the capital magnets of Silicon Valley and New York no longer applies. Chicago can provide its own seed funding now, and keeping talent and growth here in the city thereby. So that brings me to the third and perhaps more important different factor now existing in Chicago. You've all heard the African proverb, "It takes a village to raise a child." Well, in many ways, it also takes a village to raise a startup. It takes peers and mentors and funders and partners and support organizations. There is an often quoted statistic you may have heard that says that about 85% of startups go out of business before year 5. The fact is that if you're an entrepreneur, the odds are frankly not in your favor. I mean, you have startupicide. Entrepreneurs need help to succeed, and until recently, Chicago lacked the glue that binds a tech community together, that village that raises the child. We just didn't have the support organizations. But in the last 5 years, we've had an absolute explosion of organizations that have formed to work with and lift up our tech entrepreneurs. BuiltInChicago.org, you may all know, Accelerate Labs, Tech Nexus, Chicago Lean Startup Circle, Ignite Chicago, Funding Feeding Frenzy, Illinois Launch, Wildcat Angels, Mid-Ventures, I can go on. And it is quite a long list. So that's number 3. Chicago has finally built the infrastructure that undergirds growth and allows entrepreneurs to engage with and learn from each other. They need to find partners, they need to find mentors and capital and increase their odds of success. And those pieces of the ecosystem that have been created are enormous help. So what's the result of all those developments? There's been, as you know, an explosion of tech startups right here in Chicago. And they're growing like weeds. Centro, Dabble, Give Forward, Sprout Social, Incisant, SA Ignite, Flower Petal, Fango, Scholar Pro, Open Chime, Fee Fighters, Tap Me, Sprout Social. I mean, you've heard all these companies, and you get the idea. It is a growing number, hundreds. And the fact that these companies exist in Chicago is in large part a result of the ecosystem that's now been built. A community that can support the successful formation and growth of technology businesses. When I said something really big and new is happening in Chicago, I meant it. But there's a fourth component, and it remains to be announced and to be opened, but we're working on it. Going back to Paul Graham's article, in his view, there are 2 things that make startup hubs work. First, being in a place where startups are the cool thing to do. And second, chance meetings, the real serendipity, with people who can help you build your business. What drives them both is the number of entrepreneurs, developers, engineers, and startup thinkers that are around you. In Chicago, we start off, frankly, with a disadvantage. We're a big city, big in area, thriving metropolis with a rich diversity of economic drivers. Chicago has the 2nd largest business district in the United States and the 4th most important business center in the world. So the density of tech entrepreneurs relative to the overall population and relative to the rest of the business community is never going to be particularly high. In Chicago, entrepreneurs tend to locate wherever they can find cheap space. And I'm always complaining that the companies that we're funding are, the startups, the pure startups, are finding sublease space that's next to the dentist, down the hall from the insurance company, but nowhere near another technology startup. It's tough. You're looking for the cheapest available space, and it isn't always next to someone who can be helpful. And the result is, of course, entrepreneurs are scattered across our city. A group of entrepreneurial tech leaders came together earlier this year to solve this problem. Matt Moog, who I mentioned earlier, who founded Viewpoints and also founded builtinchicago.org, which is our virtual meeting place here in Chicago, builtinchicago.org. He's leading a major civic endeavor with Kevin Willer, who you'll meet shortly, who now heads the Chicagoland Entrepreneurial Center. Together with over 100 technology leaders across the city, as well as with the support of the city and the state, we're building a new home for startups here in Chicago. An affordable, centrally located place where entrepreneurs can come to build their businesses. A place that creates the kind of thriving center of our ecosystem that can help catalyze entrepreneurial activity and to provide what Paul Graham referred to as the antidote to startupicide. That'll be the fourth pillar of our ecosystem, a place, and it's just around the corner. It shouldn't be surprising to anyone that Chicago has emerged as a world-class city for digital startups. Innovation is in our DNA. The Chicago Fire, which happened in 1871, was frankly an awful thing to have happen, but it also was the beginning of building a new Chicago. Something amazing has happened to Chicago. People, the DNA that's been built into people in Chicago really came out of that tragedy. Well, there are a lot of historical references to Chicago's innovation DNA, but their modern inheritors are here today. Where does Ruby on Rails come from? Right here, 37 signals. Why did RSS take off? FeedBurner, founded right here in Chicago and acquired by Google. Who perfected the online daily deal space? Groupon. Who created the first global electronic trading platform for futures contracts? The Chicago Mercantile Exchange. Who brought online options trading to the masses? Options Express. Those are all Chicago companies. And by the way, Chicago has more Nobel Prize winners than any other city in the world. If you didn't know these things already, there's a good reason. Chicagoans have always been humble, pragmatic visionaries, less about creating flash than about getting things done. Daniel Burnham had a far-reaching vision for a lakefront city, and then he made it happen. Mayor Daley envisioned recreating the Loop lakefront by transforming it into Millennium Park. It was innovative and daring, and it required the moxie to make it happen. No one stood up and waved their arms, none of those people, and said, hey, look at me. They just put their heads down and they made it happen. Chicago entrepreneurs have bold ideas and the mettle to get them done. And here's another thing that's always been true about Chicago. If your company is selling to businesses, then you're coming to Chicago, because the Midwest has the largest concentration of Fortune 500 companies in the country. We have many of the most successful healthcare, consumer goods, manufacturing companies, the best financial services and law firms, and the largest energy and transportation companies. When Ron Conway was at Accelerate this summer, he commented that Chicagoans are much better at giving back than people in Silicon Valley, mentoring, advising, and nurturing the next generation. It's embedded in our DNA. If you stand on a street corner in Chicago and fumble with a map, I guarantee at least 3 Chicagoans will come up to you and ask you if they can help you get where you're going. That doesn't happen in any other big city in America. Maybe if you're a VC from Palo Alto, you think we're too nice here. But frankly, we're tough. Just look at our current mayor. Our current effing mayor. He gives us all permission to use that language, by the way. They don't call him Rambo for nothing. Chicagoans do what we need to do to get things done. And you know what? In the tech entrepreneur community, something big is happening. It's happening here in Chicago. It's happening now. and it's really, really big. Thank you very much.